You are listening to KSG Podcast. This is a short, crisp, concise, exam-oriented editorial for civil services aspirants. In this podcast, we are going to talk about what are humanitarian corridors. Source for the content is Deutsche Welle's article for the Indian Express. The United Nations considers humanitarian corridors to be one of several possible forms of a temporary pause of armed conflict. They are demilitarized zones in a specific area and for a specific time, and both sides of an armed conflict agree to them. Now, what are they for? Via these corridors, either food and medical aid can be brought to areas of conflict or civilians can be evacuated. The corridors are necessary when cities are under siege and the population is cut off from basic food supplies, electricity, and water. In cases where a humanitarian catastrophe unfolds because the international law of war is being violated, for example through large-scale bombing of civilian targets, humanitarian corridors can provide crucial relief. Now, who sets them up? In most cases, humanitarian corridors are negotiated by the United Nations. Sometimes they are also set up by local groups. Since all sides need to agree to set up the corridors, there is a risk of military or political abuse. For example, the corridors can be used to smuggle weapons and fuel into besieged cities. On the other hand, they can also be used by UN observers, NGOs, and journalists to gain access to contested areas where war crimes are being committed. Now, what corridors have been established in Ukraine? In eastern Ukraine, a 5-hour ceasefire was to be in place on the 5th of March 2022 to allow around 200,000 people from Mariupol and 15,000 residents from the city of Volnovakha to leave. But the initiative failed after a few hours. The Mariupol city administration said the evacuation had been postponed for security reasons because Russian troops continued to bomb the city and its surroundings. According to news agency Reuters, Russia, however, said the corridors set up near Mariupol and Volnovakha had not been used. Russian news agency RIA said nationalists prevented the civilians from escaping and that Russian troops also came under fire during the ceasefire. Ukraine also said that in the port city of Kherson, Russia had not fulfilled the promise of a corridor and that 19 vehicles with humanitarian aid had not been allowed through. Instead, the Russians themselves planned to send high-profile support to the civilian population. Kherson Mayor Igor Kolikhaev wrote in a Facebook post. He wrote, and I quote, "First, they brought the situation to a critical state and then they rescue us so that we can thank our benefactor for the cameras." Unquote. So who gets access? Access to humanitarian corridors is determined by the parties to the conflict. It's usually limited to neutral actors, the UN or aid organizations such as the Red Cross. They also determine the length of time, the area, and which means of transport, trucks, buses, or planes, are allowed to use the corridor. In rare cases, humanitarian corridors are only organized by one of the parties to the conflict. This happened with the American airlift after the Berlin blockade by the Soviet Union in 1948 and 1949. Talking about where else they have been used, humanitarian corridors have been put in place since the mid-20th century. For example, during the so-called Kinder transport from 1938 to 1939, Jewish children were evacuated to the United Kingdom from areas under Nazi control. Humanitarian corridors were also created during the 1992 to 1995 siege of Sarajevo, Bosnia, and the 2018 evacuation of Ghouta, Syria. However, there are many wars and conflicts where calls for civilian corridors or a pause in fighting have been made in vain. In the ongoing war in Yemen, for instance, the UN has so far failed in its negotiations. That's it for this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. To join KSG India courses and to crack the ICE exam, visit ksgindia.com. You can also get a PDF of this podcast on ksgindia.com. Thanks for listening.